One of the most bizarre concepts ever proposed by science claims that absolute death does not exist. According to the theory of quantum immortality, your consciousness never ceases to exist. It merely jumps to other parallel realities. And here is the secret that has been hidden from most of us, and that a few don't want you to know. The Bardo Thodol, an ancient Tibetan text, has been describing this for centuries. Ancient spiritual teachings of the Bardo Thodol guarantee that at the moment we call death, our mind faces dramatic choices, opening doors to alternative realities. Now, experts are shocking the world by suggesting that physics and ancient traditions speak exactly the same language, affirming that our life is merely a sequence of transitory states. The most controversial part is that every decision made today directly influences which reality you will inhabit after death. A discovery that challenges our identity, ethics, and even the idea of personal responsibility. What we call the end may be just the beginning of a terrifying and infinite journey.
Many people have no idea how certain scientific theories and ancient traditions can converge on topics seen as taboo. Some say that death, treated as an absolute endpoint, has never been definitively proven. That might sound almost outrageous to more skeptical minds, but it raises questions about the true nature of what we call reality and finality. It could be that cutting-edge researchers and spiritual masters, whether consciously or not, avoid giving wide publicity to interpretations that could undermine long-held beliefs about the end of life. Such a scenario suggests more than mere intellectual curiosity. It involves the possibility of hidden dimensions and passageways that escape an immediate glance. In some areas of contemporary physics, models are emerging that argue for subjective immortality, while Tibetan records refer to mental states that transcend the shutdown of vital functions. One notable example is the Bardo Thodol, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This text describes, symbolically and practically, what would happen after the last breath, offering instructions that seem to foreshadow, in an allegorical sense, notions that quantum physics would only explore centuries later. Some see more than mere coincidence in this connection. Before diving into very specific theories, it is worth noting how this territory becomes even more intriguing when you realize that, in quantum mechanics, some radical interpretations question the idea that the observer can witness their own definitive extinction. In this context, observer does not always mean a conscious human being, but in a philosophical view, this active perception is often likened to the mind. And suppose every quantum process unfolds into infinite possible branches, as in the many worlds interpretation, for example. In that case, our common notion of a terminal death can really be called into question. From this perspective, we might ask whether there truly is a final event of total collapse, or if reality works more like a maze of possibilities. For those who study the Bardo Thodol, death is not an end, but a transition into another type of experience. Accounts describe mental landscapes that appear before the deceased, reflecting their own inner tendencies. Meanwhile, the wave function does not collapse in a single direction in non-orthodox quantum interpretations. Instead, it remains, splitting into universes that remain out of each other's reach. Seen this way, the idea that one can survive each threat in some branch is not mere fiction. After all, the subjective I would only continue where it remains alive, never in the branch where it was destroyed. However, many people find this hypothesis an over-the-top fantasy. More conservative physicists prefer not to involve the idea of mind or perception in this debate, attributing collapse to interactions with large-scale environments. Meanwhile, conspiracy voices hint that academic institutions shy away from delving into any parallels between science and spirituality, fearing skepticism in the community, or, on the flip side, fueling mystical theories considered unfit for scientific discourse. On the other hand, there are Tibetan masters who show genuine interest in modern physics, pointing out that their tradition has long discussed dimensions, transitions, and realities layered over what appears to be our normal existence. Another question is, if this so-called subjective immortality is more than mere fiction, what practical implications arise? How do we view our choices? Would a person be more inclined to take risks, believing they will always survive somewhere in some universe? Or perhaps they would realize their actions have consequences in each dimension they travel through, strengthening the sense of responsibility. These questions are not trivial. The Bardo Thodol, for example, emphasizes that after death, the mind encounters its own inner creations. There is no escape from the repercussions of what one did, thought, or felt in life. Each decision inexorably shapes the later scenario. That logic is similar to what some quantum physicists claim about the observer's participation in subatomic phenomena, though on a different discursive level. Some suspect a silent pact among academic groups so that such ideas do not become popular because they would shake philosophical, religious, and even socio-economic structures. Imagining that death might not be a rigid boundary can destabilize billion-dollar enterprises that feed on the fear of the end, the sale of supernatural solutions, or even rigid belief systems that control entire populations. Whether the conspiracy theory is real or not, it is enough to notice how rarely open discussions of quantum immortality appear at prestigious conferences, compared to the fascination the topic holds among counterculture and alternative circles. The general idea is that death, viewed as the ultimate endpoint, may have been assumed as unquestionable, but not scientifically proven at the most fundamental level. If consciousness or perception is intertwined in an unsuspected way with the branching of the universe, then the whole structure supporting the final fear could collapse. This is not just a topic for academic debates. It strikes at the core of how we spend our lives, our values, and our search for existential meaning. From the Tibetan perspective, it also reinforces the importance of cultivating mental presence, whether to navigate the post-death transition or to explore levels of understanding that go beyond the limits of the body. In the early 20th century, few people suspected that the seemingly solid Newtonian physics contained cracks that would lead to something as counterintuitive as quantum mechanics. Max Planck realized that radiation is quantized, while Einstein showed that light sometimes behaves like a wave, sometimes like a particle. This duality undermined the comfortable concept of an objective, predictable reality. To make matters more complicated, the double-slit experiments revealed that electrons and photons exist in superpositions of states, only making up their minds when some kind of measurement is taken. This decision moment, which many called the quantum collapse, raised a critical question. Could perception itself be the factor that determines how matter is manifested? Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg proposed what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation. In essence, it claimed that quantum physics describes probabilities up until the moment of observation, when the wave function collapses and a single outcome emerges. However, there was another group of theorists who were dissatisfied with this nearly magical idea of an observer causing a particle to choose a location just by looking at it. Hugh Everett introduced the famous many worlds interpretation, suggesting that there is actually no real collapse. For him, all outcomes occur in parallel universes that do not interfere with each other. Thus, when opening the box in Schrödinger's famous thought experiment, one participant ends up in a world where the cat is alive, and, at the same time, in another where the cat is dead, with no communication between those worlds. While Western scientists engaged in intense intellectual battles over which quantum interpretation was more correct, or less absurd, the Bardo Thodol was beginning to gain fame in the West through translations, connecting concepts like rebirth and intermediate states to a public curious about Tibetan Buddhism. Although this contemplative text predates the industrial era by a long time, it describes symbolically how the mind navigates internal realities at the moment of death. What stands out is the emphasis on the influence of one's own mental state on the visions that appear, which may be terrifying or sublime. In more modern language, you might say the perception of the agent defines which scenario takes center stage. That is not far from the notion that the participant, by measuring a quantum system, determines the direction the phenomenon takes. People who study both quantum mechanics and the Bardo Thodol cannot help but notice a potential resonance. The multiplicity of realms of experience. In Tibetan, there is talk of different bardos and possible rebirths, alongside the multiplicity of possible realities in the many worlds. The inevitable question: could the Tibetan monks, without knowing Schrödinger's equations or Planck's constants, have been talking in spiritual terms about something analogous to what quantum physics would later discover, or is it all just a poetic coincidence? For those who lean toward conspiracies, there is evidence that certain academic groups consider it dangerous to link science with mystical ideas, fearing a loss of credibility or creating room for disputes. The outcome would be a deliberate withdrawal from any studies exploring, without prejudice, the bridges between Eastern meditative practices and advanced quantum interpretations. It is worth noting that other schools of Buddhism, such as Zen and Theravada, address death in different ways. Zen emphasizes mental emptying and the dissolution of concepts, while Theravada focuses on the direct investigation of sensations and the conditioned emergence of each moment. However, Tibetan Buddhism, especially in the Nyingma and Kagyu lineages, places a lot of emphasis on the transitional moments after death, offering detailed teachings on what happens in this interval. Although they may differ in details, all these branches agree that there is no static, unchanging self. Experience flows, whether in the present moment or in post-life stages. In modern terms, it would be like saying that the idea of a particle having a well-defined position at all times is an illusion. There are probabilities of momentary emergencies, and the notion of something fixed is just a limited way of seeing reality. The fact that Einstein did not interact directly with Tibetan masters during his lectures does not change the observation that, at the same time, the foundations of classical physics were being challenged in Europe, and translations of Tibetan teachings on life and death were reaching the West. Some like to see a historical synchronicity in this, a kind of cultural ferment that allowed the world to question both the solidity of matter and the rigidity of religious beliefs at the same time. It was within this zeitgeist that figures like Carl Jung emerged, trying to connect Eastern concepts to depth psychology, or later Francisco Varela, a scientist and Buddhist practitioner who pursued links between neuroscience and meditation. Although not strictly quantum mechanics, this reinforces the feeling that the curiosity to unify science and spirituality has never disappeared, despite pressures to keep them in separate realms. Therefore, it is not so strange to relate the ideas of the Bardo Thodol to the quantum universe. What might bother the more orthodox is precisely the courage to regard reality as something that does not fit into the linear models of an existence that ends completely. Anyone who embraces this thinking might discover that the borders between life and death, matter and mind, are far from impassable. It is a step that opens up an enormous range of questions. How do we interpret existence? What value do we give to the fear of death? And why worry so much about the consequences of each choice if there are infinite branches of worlds unfolding in parallel? One of the most controversial points in this convergence is what is called quantum immortality. In broad terms, it asserts that an individual would never experience their own extinction because when a lethal situation occurs, there is always, in terms of the many worlds, at least one timeline in which they manage to survive. Therefore, the only perceptible sequence will be the one where the I stays alive. Most scientists see this as a mere thought experiment that takes the many worlds interpretation too far, but some people take it seriously, arguing that there is nothing in quantum laws that rules out the possibility of one's subjective awareness shifting to branches where that person remains alive. At the same time, the Bardo Thodol describes what happens after the body dies. From the Tibetan perspective, the psyche goes through stages called bardos, in which visions of wrathful or compassionate deities, brilliant lights, and other projections come and go according to the clarity of the person who passed away. The teaching is to recognize these manifestations as mental creations, avoiding the fear or attachment that could lead to confused rebirths. Instead of parallel physical universes, you have psychic worlds, which are just as real to those who experience them, shaped by karma and by ignorance or wisdom gained over time. Some see a structural equivalence here. In the Bardo Thodol, multiple scenarios coexist as tendencies. In quantum immortality, multiple scenarios actually unfold in parallel branches of reality. In both cases, the participant, awareness, agent, consciousness, moves forward, even though the usual body is gone or the quantum particle has split into superpositions. It is not that Tibetans were specifically talking about wave function collapse, but their emphasis on the mind as creator of worlds anticipates, metaphorically, profound considerations that modern science is only now beginning to accept as a legitimate part of the discussion. How many academic groups prefer not to discuss openly the possibility that the mind does not disappear? What would the consequences be in a society that profits from stoking the fear of the end? Critics often respond with, if quantum immortality were real, why don't we see people openly courting death every day, playing quantum Russian roulette without worry? The usual answer is that in the branch where the person dies, they do not go on to note their failure. Only the surviving version perceives the continuity. In practice, there is no tangible advantage in forcing that scenario because it does not negate the fact that, in all the other branches, death really happened. Those who see parallels in the Bardo Thodol might argue that, even if new dimensions exist after death, states of suffering or mental confusion still unfold for someone lacking clarity. In other words, seeking irresponsibility would not be a smart move from either the quantum or the Tibetan viewpoint. Another sensitive issue is the word death itself. Some researchers prefer to talk about state transition or break in physical continuity because the notion of a total end is already riddled with loopholes. Buddhism in general questions the idea of a permanent self that can die, while quantum theory questions the idea of a single reality that is defined without ambiguity. When these two views come together, it seems that life, at least as we typically understand it, is just one facet of something much broader and more dynamic. From that angle, quantum immortality and the Bardo Thodol are both speaking, in their own ways, about the infinite nature of possibilities. Not everyone is ready to accept that existence is so open and, at the same time, so shaped by individual choices. Some authors have tried to explore this bridge in more depth. Michael Lockwood, for example, devoted part of his philosophical reflections to the many worlds interpretation, questioning its implications for personal identity. Alan Wallace, a former Buddhist monk with a doctorate in religious studies, speaks at international conferences on how modern physics could interact with contemplative principles. While he does not explicitly push for a total fusion of quantum theory and Buddhism, he shows that certain studies of the observer's nature could benefit from what Tibetan monks have been practicing and describing for centuries. Yet, such discussions rarely make it into the top theoretical physics journals, even when the math points toward hypotheses that come close to Tibetan views on the mind. That is more than enough reason to speculate. Some say research centers adopt a hardline position so that science will not be contaminated by spiritual fantasies. On the other side, there are Buddhists who also hesitate to see their teachings watered down into a kind of positive thinking or exotic mysticism. Evidence points to the resistance of well-established scientific or religious institutions to open space for discussions that undermine dogmas and certainties. After all, if death is not a terminal event in the sense that there is no perception registering its extinction, then what do we say about the fear that drives so many power structures? It is understandable that this topic would be labeled dangerous, since it affects not just academic theories, but also how society organizes itself around rituals, beliefs, and control systems. To illustrate, we recall Schrödinger's cat, a cat in a box with a vial of poison triggered by an uncertain quantum event. Without opening the box, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, in a superposition of states. The baffling question is, who or what decides whether the cat lives or dies? In the Copenhagen interpretation, the act of observing, when opening the box, causes the apparent collapse. In the many worlds interpretation, the wave function never collapses. It just splits into two branches, one in which the cat lives and another in which it dies. Now consider the more grim thought experiment called quantum Russian roulette. The person pulls the trigger, and the firing of the bullet depends on a random quantum event. Each time they pull the trigger, there are branches where the person dies and branches where they survive. From the shooter's viewpoint, awareness continues only in the universes where they do not die. It sounds like science fiction, but that is exactly the scenario quantum immortality contemplates. Some argue that discussions along these lines are suppressed to stop people from questioning the existential foundations promoted by dominant religions and ideologies. Linking this to the Bardo Thodol, there is another form of roulette. Instead of bullets and quantum probabilities, there are internal transitions after physical death. These are visions that can be terrifying or luminous, and the way one reacts determines whether the flow of the psyche goes to more positive realms or sinks into suffering. It is as if every sensation of fear or clarity were a trigger that opens up a range of future experiences. This parallel might seem forced, but it sparks a reflection. In both the quantum thought experiment and the Tibetan Guide to the Dead, the mind or psyche or perception plays the starring role. It shapes the reality it experiences. In one case, the multiplicity is theoretical and physical, and in the other it is symbolic and psychological. But the core is the same. Infinite paths are at play, and the way we handle situations determines which doorway we pass through. People who explore the dialogue between mind sciences and contemplative traditions know that, although the Bardo Thodol deals with subtle matters, there is a strong practical emphasis on preparing for the final moment. Tibetan monks train in specific meditations to remain lucid throughout the dying process, something that contrasts with Western culture, where death is usually denied or treated as a taboo. When you compare this with many world speculations, you get the idea that collapse is not precisely an abrupt phenomenon that wipes out all other possibilities, but rather a consequence of the viewpoint we adopt. One could say that both science and Tibetan Buddhism have been probing forbidden zones, opening cracks in a paradigm that insists on treating death as something closed and singular. Another question arises about identity. If there are countless branches, are there countless me's? In the Bardo Thodol, which talks about rebirth, is there really a persisting I, or just a flow of karmic tendencies? Buddhism says there is no permanent self, only a chain of habits, memories, and impulses that continues from life to life. The many worlds interpretation also dismantles the notion of a single self, because each quantum event spawns duplications that diverge over time. All of this suggests that a person is more like a bridge of momentary perceptions than an indivisible entity. That is not a reassuring idea for anyone who craves absolute certainties. Hence, the conspiracy thesis: it is much easier and more profitable to feed populations simple, dogmatic truths than to encourage people to face the radical fluidity of existence. The goal is to stress the impact of these thought experiments, not just in theory, but in day-to-day perspectives on life. If you consider it possible that the mind cannot experience its own end, you might be freed from certain fears, but you also face a tremendous responsibility. Everything you do resonates in countless branches. Looking at the Bardo Thodol, the message is similar. No action goes unnoticed because internal tendencies come roaring back in the transition moment. Both quantum Russian roulette and the Tibetan journey through the Bardos carry a warning. There is no escape from consequences. There may be infinite branches, but each one extracts its price. The implications of quantum immortality and the Bardo Thodol go beyond theory and ripple into ethics, the sense of purpose, and even mental health. If death were not really an end, but a gateway, society would face a shock to the systems that make people fear the unknown. Part of mainstream religion bases much of its power on the mystery of the afterlife, offering dogmas that promise salvation or punishment. If instead, people perceived that existence unfolds in continuous states or in continuous parallel universes, fear might subside, weakening the grip of religious institutions that have controlled behavior for centuries through the threat of eternal torment. It would be no surprise to imagine groups with a vested interest in keeping the population under rigid dogmas lobbying to categorize quantum immortality and Tibetan ideas as fantasy. After all, a society that no longer fears an absolute end might feel freer to experiment, create, question established authority, and perhaps let go of beliefs once seen as unshakable. It is also worth noting that Tibetan Buddhism is not limited to the Bardo Thodol. There are other scriptures and practices describing how the psyche can achieve realization here and now without waiting for physical death. Yet the Bardo Thodol stands as an iconic example. It deals head-on with the dying process, instructing practitioners to recognize that everything beyond is a reflection of internal processes. Practically speaking, some research groups in transpersonal psychology and contemplative neuroscience have started using both quantum principles, like paying attention to the role of the participant, and Tibetan meditation methods, focused on states of concentration and compassion, to help people cope with the fear of death, phobias, or existential anxiety. The idea is that if someone recognizes reality as, to some extent, a reflection of their internal structure, they can break cycles of trauma or panic. Such work is viewed with suspicion because it undermines the patient's passive role, making them an active agent of deep change. Widening the scope to society at large, there are political and social implications, since an individual who realizes their capacity to choose, even in supposedly definitive scenarios, is more likely to question the status quo. Some theorists, such as the physicist David Bohm, while not directly referring to quantum immortality, propose the existence of an implicate order in which mind and matter interweave in ways not yet grasped by official science. Bohm interacted with the spiritual teacher Krishnamurti, and they both explored the idea that perception creates fragmentation in the wholeness of reality. Those thoughts resonate with the Bardo Thodol, which underscores the unity of a flow of psychic experience, disrupted only by the illusion of separation. Again, none of this is solid proof that quantum immortality is real, but it does fuel the suspicion that beneath our tangible world there could be layers as subtle as they are powerful, layers that do not fit within a purely materialistic framework. The Bardo Thodol, which some consider just a ritual manual for monks, can be read as a guide describing intense psychological processes, indicating that external reality is not as objective as we tend to assume. Quantum physics, at the same time, uses experiments that prove the probabilistic nature of the subatomic world, suggesting that what we label real depends on a process of measurement or participation that nobody has fully figured out. Suppose quantum immortality contains even a partial truth. In that case, it means each person lives subjectively, in a sequence in which they remain alive, and death would merely be a jump outside the dimension of perception we can register. Meanwhile, Bardo Thodol would say that the mind leaps into another state in which karmic energy and mental habits shape the experience. Strange as it may seem, this view does not have to imply escapism. Some see it as a radical liberation from paralyzing fears. Others worry that if death is not the end, people might feel tempted to dismiss the consequences. That is why so many serious spiritual teachers and physicists stress that even if there are parallel universes or multiple bardos, the choices here and now define the kind of transition we will face. You do not simply jump from one branch to another at will. And if the mind collapses or participates in possibilities, there must be coherence between intentions and outcomes. In other words, there is no room for indifference or reckless hedonism. We now arrive at an even more intriguing view: freedom. If death is not a rigid boundary, then life is no longer chained by the ticking clock that zeroes everything out in the end. On the other hand, the commitment to inner development becomes huge because the quality of each transition depends on the level of clarity or confusion at play. The Bardo Thodol stresses that the individual is confronted with facets of their own mind: wrathful gods, peaceful divinities, lights, and darkness, all part of a mental landscape that appears with great intensity. Likewise, the many worlds interpretation suggests a proliferation of realities, where each decision, no matter how small, creates developments that become separate universes. At the center of this web of possibilities, perception is challenged to realize its power and responsibility. Understandably, this makes people uncomfortable. Some respond with outrage, seeing this as an improper mix of physics and esotericism. Still, curiosity remains because the historical development of quantum mechanics left philosophical themes unanswered by pure mathematics. This unexplored territory is, in its own strangeness, reminiscent of spiritual accounts from many cultures, not only Tibet. In ancient Egypt, for instance, there was the Book of the Dead, also filled with symbols and warnings about the afterlife. In the shamanic traditions of the Americas, references to parallel realms accessible during trance states were common. If 21st century science tackles these matters with an open mind, without panicking about sounding unorthodox, what might emerge? Behind the scenes, rumors are floating around that certain tech companies are already quietly researching quantum mechanics applications that go beyond computing or cryptography. Some people speculate about consciousness-computer interfaces, studies of quantum perception in biological brains, and even patents aiming to capture subtle mental processes. The level of investment in cutting-edge research, coupled with the difficulty of public access to full results, keeps fueling the idea that someone wants to either harness or suppress discoveries that could shake up markets and institutions. And if some of those breakthroughs confirmed, for instance, that the psyche can persist in ways science does not yet understand, the impact on our ideas of health, spirituality, and law would be impossible to predict. The Bardo Thodol, which some people see as just a ritual text for Tibetan monks, can be re-examined as a manual that describes intense psychic processes. It shows that external reality may not be as objective as we assume. Meanwhile, quantum physics demonstrates the probabilistic nature of the subatomic realm, indicating that what we call reality depends on some unknown form of measurement or participation. If there is truth to quantum immortality, then each of us experiences, from a personal perspective, a sequence in which we remain alive. Death would only be a leap beyond the dimension we can perceive. The Bardo Thodol, in turn, says the mind leaps to another state in which karmic energy and mental habits decide our experience. As strange as it sounds, this does not have to be a recipe for avoidance or denial. Some see it as a release from the grip of paralyzing dread. Others fear that if death is not truly the end, it might encourage recklessness. That is why many spiritual masters and serious physicists note that even if parallel universes or multiple bardos exist, our choices in this moment shape the transition ahead. Leaping into a more favorable universe or a gentler bardo is not automatic. It depends on the level of clarity and growth each person has achieved. The conclusion that arises from these ideas is both unsettling and fascinating. Life is not just about being born, growing, and dying. It is, ultimately, an endless dance of possibilities, physical or mental, in which the participant plays an active role. The Bardo Thodol describes this dance in symbolic terms and quantum mechanics in mathematical terms. And if, behind all this uproar, there is a truth that few dare to face head-on, it may be that death, as an absolute end, is more of a cultural convention than an objective fact. For many, that would be the biggest conspiracy of all, keeping people ignorant of the fact that their essence, whether understood as a flow or as perception, extends beyond the boundaries of a single body or a single story. All change begins when you understand your role as a co-creator, and the only way to tap into this divine intelligence is through meditation. We have put together a set of audio tools to help you reach this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, comment below, "It made sense to me."